I am so happy to have you with me. We're picking up our story concerning the church. Who are we really, and what are we supposed to be about? And we're telling this story by telling a much longer story that begins with the very origins of the earth and of Israel. So we said last time that Judahites, now under Roman domination, were in a period of tremendous spiritual and theological creativity, a time in which there were many movements that came into being, many leaders, many teachers. The great question remained, what is the right way to be faithful to the mysterious, liberating God of Exodus, the God who made a covenant with the people? Who is this mysterious, holy God? And in order to answer that question, they were engaged with the question of what is the right way to interpret and to understand and to put into practice the ancient traditions of Israel and Judah. It turned out that before they could even answer that question, they had to come to some agreement on what are the traditions that they should pay attention to. So there was a great deal of disagreement among Judahites, Jews, about which writings should be regarded as sacred. They had a whole bunch of writings. Which ones are properly sacred? Which ones properly speak, reveal the will of the one mysterious God? Which ones rightly teach God's ways? There was one group who came to be called the Sadducees, who taught that the only texts, and therefore the only traditions, which were to be regarded as truly teaching God's ways, were what we call the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But there was another group who came to be called Pharisees, and they argued that those books certainly are sacred. They certainly do tell the truth about God, but in addition, we have to attend to the writings of the prophets, which for Judahites include not only books like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but also books like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. We have to pay attention to all of those books and some other books that are just called the writings, like Psalms and Proverbs and others, and an oral tradition, which includes how to interpret these texts. And then there were other movements and teachers and leaders. There were separatists who went and lived in the desert to be apart from the pagans. There was a great deal of argument and disagreement. There was also argument and disagreement about how to regard and worship God in relation to the temple, and how to live in the tension between temple and synagogue. What is the status of each? Temple, synagogue, sacrifices, scripture and prayer. How are they related to each other? And what is the meaning of the temple? What is true and proper worship of the one mysterious, all-powerful God? Those questions all circle around the question of the temple and the synagogue. Another question that they engaged with, argued about, that was pressed upon them is, what is the status of the land? They believed that the land had been promised to them by God. But now, in the renewed situation, what is the status now of the land and the promise from God of the land? How does the land figure in God's will for Judah and for this blessing which is promised to the whole earth and to all the tribes of all the peoples? And finally, a pressing question, much discussed and argued about, was, what is the identity, what's the proper identity of the people of God? Who are the people of God? What are the boundaries of the people of God? Who's inside the boundary and who is outside? And what does it really mean to be one of God's people? What is required of one to be one of God's people? And the question looming over all of this is, yes, many of us have come back from exile in Babylon, but still Judahites are dispersed everywhere in the Roman Empire and even beyond. When does exile end? When does God end Israel and Judah's terrible exile? With that question hovering before us, we set aside our discussion, and I look forward to being with you again next week. Thank you.